Hello, everyone, to DieFest Global 2022, and thank you for attending today's session about how culture shapes sustainability practice, building inclusivity within the gaming industry. It is our honor to have you with us today, and please welcome our moderator, Alice Yuan.
Welcome, everyone, and I'm so excited to be your moderator for today's discussion. Thank you, Sean, for the wonderful introduction. I wanted to quickly introduce myself. I am an executive coordinator with the North American Association of Asian Professionals, lovingly known as NAP. The Toronto chapter, and they're a community partner for today's panel, and I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this. So NAP is an international not-for-profit organization dedicated to fostering leadership, career advancement, the diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Now, joining me today are our two panelists, Tina Mary and Rachel Irvin Halliday. Tina Mary is a cross-cultural consultant, facilitator, and speaker, and is on a mission to help make the world a better place. She specializes in cultural intelligence, unconscious bias, distributed and external software development, game development, and project management. Rachel Irvin Halliday is Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leader at Amazon Games. Her expertise and key focus areas include DEI strategy and execution, organizational effectiveness and change management, talent and leadership development, and program design and delivery. Wow, I just know we're going to have a really fruitful conversation today after all of that. Before we dive in, Tina and Rachel, why don't we let our audience get to know you a little bit more by sharing a little fun fact about yourself. Tina, how about we have you go first?
Sure, thanks, Alice, and thanks for the great introduction. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first LinkedIn Live event to be on the show, so this is great. A fun fact, in addition to my time, I spent time as an expatriate living in Romania, Sweden, and the UK. And in addition to that, I've had a chance as part of my work with global teams and in the games industry to spend over 6 months in Russia. So although I've never lived there, I've spent extensive time there working with my colleagues there, and it was a really positive experience.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's amazing, Tina. That sounds like really great experiences, and I'm sure the audience would love to know more about it, but maybe in a different discussion. Rachel, how about you?
Fun fact, let me see. I have traveled to, lived in upwards of about 32 different countries in my life on this globe through work, through personal travel. And I think that's why this topic is so important to me. The privilege that I've had to be able to go and visit so many different countries and meet such wonderful people around this world and learn more and be curious. It's a topic very close to my heart.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that'll all come together in our discussion today. And so excited to hear about what you're going to bring to this conversation. All right, before we dive in, did want to quickly go over what we're going to be talking about today. Over the next hour, we'll be talking about cultural intelligence and inclusivity in the gaming industry. First, we'll lay a foundation for the discussion and start with the basics. Then we'll talk about the role of innovation and culture that it plays in the gaming industry, followed by why we should care about this topic. Finishing up with a look at the barriers organizations face when implementing it into their business strategy and what steps an organization can take. Of course, throughout the discussion, if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. All right, now let's get started and get into the fun stuff. So let's start with you, Tina. We talk about EQ and IQ a lot, and we know what those are. Let's divert to CQ. What does it mean, and what does it consist of?
Thanks, yes. So first of all, CQ is an abbreviation for cultural intelligence. And before we dive into that definition, I think we should step back and talk about what we mean by culture and cultural diversity, just to be really on the same page, because I think we tend to default to thinking about culture in the context of things like nationality, ethnicity, where were we born, where were our grandparents born. But culture is so many other things, especially when we think about it in the context of things like the games industry. So we can think about the different genders showing up in the workplace, the different age groups, the different functional roles, artists versus engineers versus producers. So the functional work groups at Electronic Arts Vancouver, we had the FIFA team versus the NHL team. The cultures on those teams were quite different. And so in all these ways, we can talk about cultural diversity, and CQ or cultural intelligence applies to all those different contexts. And the formal definition is cultural intelligence is a form of intelligence that allows us to predict our ability to be effective working across culturally diverse situations. In other words, our ability to work and relate to somebody quite different than ourselves. And this is a form of intelligence which, similar to EQ, we can develop. We can measure it, we can develop it over time, we can intentionally grow our ability to be more effective working with those different than ourselves. And within the CQ or cultural intelligence framework, there's 4 capabilities that are being measured and understood and developed. The first one represents our motivation. It's CQ drive. Do we want to engage with people different than ourselves? Do we enjoy it? Are we confident we'll be successful when we do so? And do we persist when it gets weird and awkward? Because, let's face it, sometimes when we're relating to someone different than ourselves, we have mistakes, we have challenges, we got to overcome them, right? So our drive, our motivation pushes us past those moments. Next, we move into CQ knowledge. Are we aware? Are we motivated? It's our cognition, our knowledge of how cultures are similar and different, my understanding of how I can interpret different behaviors in the workplace in Romania versus Vancouver, or the motivations for different age groups in the workplace and so on, how we make decisions. So understanding that and being motivated to deal with it is where we have to start. But where cultural intelligence in the framework makes a difference is the next 2 capabilities. We move into strategy. Are we aware of the fact that we're going into a cultural interaction ahead of time? And do we do some planning? Are we aware in the moment, checking our assumptions and seeing if all voices are heard? And do we, after the fact, review what assumptions we made and see if we were successful and maybe readjust our mental map for the next time we deal with that culture group? And then the last capability is referred to as CQ action. It's our behaviors. This is where we really adapt our style to be more effective. So my ability to be more effective with my team as a leader in Vancouver looked a little bit different than the leadership style my team in Russia wanted from me. And that would show up in a variety of different ways in how I provided the work, how I give praise, how I thought about decision-making and so on. So all of these 4 capabilities together are what we refer to as cultural intelligence, and all of them are really important for us to be culturally inclusive.
Thanks for getting us all on the same page, Tina. I think, yeah, absolutely. When we think about culture, when we think about inclusivity, perhaps we all have our own idea of what that looks like. So thanks for defining that for us so that we're all on the same page as we move forward in the discussion. And of course, that was a lot of great information about cultural intelligence. I'm not going to speak for the viewers, but I know for myself, that was a lot of great knowledge to know what is cultural intelligence, what is it made up of? And those are great things to know as we move forward in terms of how do we actually use cultural intelligence then. That being said, Rachel, I'd love to move to you and get to know how might large organizations measure and improve their CQ? Where can we start?
Data. That's the best place to start, is look at your data. So I would say your employee data and your customer data, because they're tied together based on what we're building. In the games industry, we build experiences. So look at your employee data. You need to start at where your organization is at currently and where your populations reside, where they're distributed across the globe, thinking about the cultures within each of those locations. For large global orgs, look at where your teams intersect is really, really important. So to Tina's point, when teams in different parts of the world are communicating with each other, what are some of the cultural implications of how they communicate, what they're communicating, how they navigate collaboration and conflict management? Collecting data about where your people sit and how well your managers are doing across those global lines as well is really, really important. Our managers are there to support our teams, and you might have a manager that's sitting in some other country, so you have to navigate building that relationship and trust. collecting the employee data and engagement feedback. So listening sessions, asking your teams what's going on, what do they feel like, what can be improved, analyzing your team's global intersections, so across the global locations. Developing your leaders to have a global mindset would probably be one of my foremost suggestions, and how large organizations maneuver and navigate this, making sure that they understand that the world we live in today is not going to be the world we live in 5 to 10 years. So we need to continue to elevate and amplify the need for a cultural awareness, sensitivity, and intelligence. But honestly, it comes down to data, your KPIs. What are you building? Why are you building it? What capabilities do you need to build it? So as Tina also mentioned, culture goes across many different things. It's not just about where I sit. It's about my background. It's my gender. It's my religion. It's how I show up. It's all of those things. And, I've worked in many different big companies over the last few decades, and you can go from one floor to another and the culture feels different. So we have to keep that in mind as well. You also have to understand your customers. So in the gaming industry, we build experiences for a global audience. And if my teams are not aware of the cultural nuances, we could build something that doesn't come across or land, or could even be offensive. So we need to listen to our employees, we need to listen to our customers, and then we need to have that lens of cultural intelligence as we start to build out strategies.
That's a lot of great information. And that's so right. When you're building something, data being able to tell you what it is that you should be focusing on, and really giving you the proof that, okay, this is where the gaps are, this is where we're doing well. I think definitely data is something that you don't want to fall short on.
Measure what
Rachel,
matters,
if
right?
I can, yes, if I can ask a follow-up question, I'm sure some people who are joining us today might be curious to know, as am I. Can you share maybe what kind of data Amazon Games is measuring? You've shared a lot of data that we could be collecting on our employees, on our customers, and even just things that we could think about in terms of, moving from one floor to another could be a different culture. What kinds of things are you measuring at Amazon Games?
Oh, we measure everything. I work for Amazon. We measure everything. It's fantastic. There's never a lack of data. For me specifically in the DEI space with games, I'm looking at engagement. I'm looking at how well are our managers managing our diverse and globally distributed teams. What are the teams saying? What are the managers saying? My time with leadership of asking those questions. For me, data is not just about a spreadsheet. It's about the conversations that I have with folks. So we run listening sessions regularly just to collect live data from folks of like what's going on, what do you need to see more of, where are the blockers or barriers that might be at play. So there's a large swath of the corporate type of data, the people, the talent, the business, the customers, but then there's it's not anecdotal, but it's the live information that we get from employees. So all of that goes into sort of the central repository for me around DEI, and where do I need to be refocusing or re-engaging or pulling back on a program or an initiative because, hey, maybe we've met the KPI that we set out for.
That's awesome. I mean, I think that's a great reminder for everybody that data isn't just living in a spreadsheet, like you said, Rachel. It comes from everywhere, and we should be mindful of that sometimes the conversations that we have at the water cooler is going to be data that will be useful for us. So thank you for bringing that up. And now that we've defined CQ and how organizations can use it, let's talk about the role that it plays as it relates to innovation and culture. So I'm going to come back to you, Tina. Can you tell us about CQ and its role with innovation? How does high CQ lead to better business outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. A key point here is to remember that diversity in itself doesn't lead to improved innovation or improved business outcomes. And that is something that is misunderstood often in efforts related to diversity and inclusion. If we go back to that research that CQ is built upon, it clearly indicates that a homogenous team that has low cultural intelligence will outperform a diverse team that is also low cultural intelligence. And if we step back, it's kind of intuitive, right? They understand each other. They work and relate well. They can make decisions better. They just are able to perform as a team more effectively. Once we introduce the cultural intelligence quotient, once we provide that multiplier, suddenly those diverse teams can leverage those diverse perspectives. We can hear more voices. We're going to get more innovative ideas brought to the table. The quieter voices are being heard. We're breaking down walls of hierarchy that might have hindered somebody's ideas from being brought forward. And we're showing a really respectful and inclusive way to decide what to do with those innovative ideas. How do we move forward with them? So really, the science shows us that increased cultural intelligence will not only improve the amount of innovative outcomes that a team will have, but it'll improve everything, their productivity, their engagement, their retention. Everything about that team is going to be performing better. Any metric we care to collect, we can probably see improvement that's correlating directly to their improvement of their cultural intelligence.
That's actually really surprising because we just think by default, oh, we have so many different people coming together in this team. Of course, they're going to perform better than, somebody who might all think the same, the homogeneous team like you're talking about, because we're all talked about, groupthink isn't good for productivity and all of that. So that's really surprising to hear you say that. Now, with that being said, part of the thing that you've talked about when you were defining CQ was, I heard a little bit about awareness in there, right? So how does that come together when we're working in a diverse team? How do we know if our diverse team isn't performing to its potential? When I'm actually in this team, I feel like, oh, this is a diverse team. We're going to work really effectively and really productively and push out some really great results. What are some things that we can look out for to know that, oh, maybe we aren't performing to our potential?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, some of the statistics that or the data points that Rachel pointed out to engagement. Do people want to be on that team? Do they ask to be part of that team? Because people know when teams are performing well and then when they synchronize well. In gaming, we'll see it in the data related to the productivity itself of the team. They'll have what we call more overhang, more unplanned work left at the end of a milestone. The quality of the game might not be as good. They're not achieving their targets of quality and productivity that they've set out to do. Their engagement with their partners might be tricky, so they might be losing talent from their partners because, again, they're not engaging effectively with those different from themselves. So the productivity of the external partner might not match the productivity of the internal team because they're not leveraging that cultural diversity effectively. So we're going to usually see it somewhere in the data, I think.
And I love coming back full circle on that. So, and that is why the data is so important. Now, shifting a little bit to you, Rachel, how can CQ impact innovation and creativity at organizations in the gaming industry?
Oh, I think that's massively. That's how they do it. It's like, you think about the fact that culturally intelligent people, employees, possess the potential to drive up innovation and creativity due to their ability to integrate the diverse resources around them, the diverse voices around them, and it helps the business make best use of all those multiple perspectives. And you think about what a multicultural workforce brings to the workplace, not just multicultural, but multidimensional, because culture, like we said, is not just a specific, I was born in this country and you were born in that. There's so much variability within that. So it helps us break down barriers, plain and simple. So if I'm working on a diverse team and I have the privilege of working with folks from across the world, like why would it behoove me to shut down those diverse perspectives? Because somebody might have the next great idea of how to solve a problem that we've been, really bumping up against, or they might have an idea to improve efficiency. All of those things are just out there. So we need to learn how to build those cultural bridges. We really need to learn how to love and appreciate the differences from each of us, because ultimately we work together. We're building experiences for others. And so the more human perspective that comes into play, the better the odds are that our innovation and creativity is going to go up. I like to think when it comes to innovation, we've got to consider the many, many different places. So taking time to consider where you need to look and listen. So it's not just all voices, it's what are the voices that we need to be amplifying and elevating? Who is being invited to the conversations that we're having? Are they being allowed to share their perspectives and ideas? Because ultimately, a culturally intelligent workforce is going to demonstrate better tolerance during times of conflict, chaos, ambiguity, which we all know we live in this world, whether you're in games or tech or just a human being. It's also going to build trust and understanding between our global colleagues. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to do great jobs and build great products. So cultural differences then become a strength in problem solving rather than an obstacle. And it ultimately improves collaboration, driving our ability to respond quicker to market changes, which we know are always ongoing. And ultimately, the thing that I think is most important, and this is from the internal perspective, is that cultural intelligence helps build psychological safety. So we know we talk about this a lot in learning and development and DEI and high performing teams, and it cannot be understated that if our teams feel safe enough to share their ideas, to push back on ideas, to share their perspectives, to ask the difficult questions without fear of retaliation or being shut down, the better the odds are that we're going to build great products.
Those were some really great nuggets there. And I saw a really good comment come in that, groupthink and homogenous groups are so dated, and we need to move forward from that. So love that comment coming in. And I think it speaks to a lot of things of what we're talking about right now. So we can obviously see from the conversation that we've had so far that cultural intelligence plays an important role for successful teams and successful organizations. But still, unless we're unclear, let's talk a little bit about why we should care about it specifically in the gaming industry. Staying with you, Rachel, we're going to make it personal for a minute. What role does culture and inclusivity play in the gaming industry, and why were you drawn to this industry in particular?
I'll start with the first one. Games are global. I mean, I'm a woman of a certain age. I've been playing games for 40 plus years. And when we started back in the early 70s playing games, there wasn't a large, diverse range of games. So we've come a long way. But if we as game companies want to continue to reach into those untapped markets, and I'm talking from a business standpoint right now, we need to understand the motivations, the cultural nuances that this untouched market wants and needs to see in gameplay. So we also owe it to our players and customers to build experiences that are reflective of those cultures. So no co-opting of a culture and, making it not something that's in line with the true reality. Player demographics have changed drastically. Like I said, I'm a 50 plus year old game player. And for many years, we didn't see women in the game. So, I'm extremely proud of the work that companies have done over the last, 20 years to amplify that as well. But we see markets expanding. We know that with that comes a responsibility to ensure that we understand our customers and players. And the thing of this is most of us that work in games play games. And I'm not saying you have to be a hardcore gamer. You could be playing 300 mobile games a year. You still play games. Games are something that they touch everybody, regardless of your age, and they bring fun. So that's what drew me to the industry. Going into the second part of your question, I sort of fell into games 20 years ago. My background is learning and development, but one of my closest friends was a producer on the NHL game and said, hey, there's a role here at Electronic Arts. I think it would fit your background. And lo and behold, I ended up spending 18 years there, building programs and teams and initiatives. And it solidified what I believe is an amazing place to work in games, because it's not all rainbows and kittens. We know that, but games actually does have an ability to amplify the diversity of what we do. When you think about the connectivity, There's been articles coming out over the last couple of weeks about the value of games to kids in terms of their learning. I look back at some of the franchises that have helped support me through my journey. The Sims, being able to go in there and choose how I show up in a game. That is incredibly powerful for somebody who might think they're alone out there in the world, and nobody else is like me. So for me, that's like a core value. There's such an opportunity for us in the gaming industry to be at the forefront of supporting positive change across games and the tech industry. And cultural intelligence, leading with empathy, are key to building engaging player experiences for our diverse players, all the while supporting the development and empowerment of the people who build the games.
Yeah, that's an amazing story that you've shared there, Rachel. I know, and I'm not sure about anyone else, but I know I've spent an embarrassingly amount of hours when Candy Crush first came out. So I can definitely agree that although I may not be playing the PC games, I definitely am a mobile gamer. And sometimes, we don't think those are the same. I wanted to dive into your background in learning and development a little bit. And I'm curious, and hopefully the viewers are too, how does that change how you approach inclusivity and cultural intelligence at your work? Or maybe how does that shift the perspective that you have on it, coming from a background in learning and development?
I think they're tied together. I could not do my job as the head of DEI without learning and development programs. Everything we do is around the supporting of the development of expanding knowledge and building competencies and capabilities. So they're intrinsically tied together. I partner with my learning team internally to make sure that the programs that we're designing and rolling out are in line with what the needs of the business, but also the needs of the employee. I will always be an L&D person, that it's learning is a core value for me, but it's intrinsically woven into anything DEI. I mean, how do I help change people? How do I help move them forward? It's through programs. It's through, and I don't use the word training. It's through experiences that they get to have on the job that then they take forward to their team. So manager development around emotional intelligence, allyship for the organization, mentoring, all of those are DEI and learning and development.
I love that connectivity that you've drawn for us to see how they all relate together. But then I also love that you've changed the training a little bit into experiences, just because the connotation of that word really does change how we think about, them as experiences. So that is
word.
I love that a lot better than what we're doing. From now on, I will be using experiences and not the word training. So Tina, coming to you, your expertise lies in consulting organizations on how to leverage cultural diversity and inclusivity for better outcomes. So why should we care about that in the gaming industry, and what other industries is it relevant to?
Well, second question first, right? The topics are relevant to any industry. I think cultural intelligence, it's a global context, a global world. And we have diversity on teams, even if they're sitting in the same city, in the same location, right? So cultural intelligence applies because we live in a highly diverse and global society, and that's the world of business that we're faced with. If we want to succeed, whether it's domestic or global in that diverse context, then we need to create psychological safety, and we need to be culturally intelligent organizations. We need to have a sustainable way to foster cultural inclusion, and that's what cultural intelligence will give us. If we think specifically about the games industry, I mean, Rachel's covered a lot of this, right? But if stepping back from the business perspective, the demand for talent's never been higher, right? Even with a lot of the layoffs going on in tech, great people will always be in demand. And with the world now the way it is, we're more hybrid, we're more remote than ever. People can hire people from anywhere in the world. How do we take advantage of that? Well, we're going to use cultural intelligence to do that, to make sure that we can bring in all this cultural diversity and benefit from it, right? So with all this increased competition for talent, my brand has to reflect a culturally intelligent, inclusive organization that people want to join. They feel like, hey, this is a place I want to be, right? So when we hear the news stories coming out of the different studios, and whether it's a good news or bad news story, what is it telling us about the culture of that organization? What do people in that company talk about? And especially when they're leaving, what do they say, right? So game companies critically need the best talent to be effective and to build the best games. So they have to have CQ.
That's a really great point. There's so many different levels of building that into the organization to, like you said, attract and retain that talent. And I think that segments really well into what we're going to be talking about next. So I'm an organization. Throughout this conversation, you've sold me on the importance of including CQ in my business strategy, but I think it would be helpful to know the barriers and the actionable steps that I can take to include it in my future strategy. So, Rachel, blank canvas. How might an organization build in culture and inclusivity as an essential part of their business strategy? What steps should they take if they haven't already thought about it?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, organizations and leaders need to understand that the future talent doesn't look or sound like them. So first and foremost, from a talent perspective, is understanding the changing nature of the talent landscape, the demographics within the future talent. So, like many of our heads of game companies are older white men. I'm not picking on them. I'm just saying that's the reality that we work in. 10 years from now, are our leadership teams going to look the same? Most likely not. The folks coming in the door, the folks that are graduating with comp sci degrees and art degrees and design, coming in from production, it's all going to be very different and continue to evolve as our demographics change. You look at the demographics of our Gen Zs, our Gen X, or Gen X, that's me, our Gen Zs, our alphabets, like all of them are coming in with different expectations of an organization. So can I come here? Will I be treated respectfully? Will I be safe? Will I be empowered to learn and grow and contribute? What is an organization doing around corporate social responsibility, around community building, internally and externally? These are expectations of our talent going forward. So as a business lead, I have to think that. I have to think about that. And how does that get brought into my business strategy overall? So for me, when I'm talking to leaders, business strategy is tied to your DEI strategy, plain and simple. So there's this pull through. I learned this from a leader years ago. It's like, what's the pull through? We can't just, DEI is not just a bolt on. Cultural intelligence is not just a bolt on. It's something that we need to weave within everything we think about. So when we're planning, we're building teams, the composition of our teams, the location, the geography, when you're starting to grow your future leaders. So starting with the data analysis of where your employees are located geographically. And then again, as I said earlier, the intersections between people managers and their teams. Are you noticing retention or attrition data that highlights specific demographics or geographies that are leaving at higher rates than others? This is this constant look at the data and what it's telling you, either month by month or quarter by quarter. Leaders and orgs also need to understand that their customers are always changing. And we've talked about this already, but they need to ask themselves of what's the impact of not being culturally aware of your customers' demographics and the impact on their business plans. So it's that mindset of really thinking about, okay, this is the today, but what's the future? What's the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And leaders need to do their own work. I'll end with this. They need to do their own work in this space. So part of my job is making sure that I am a support mechanism for leaders as they continue to grow, because everybody's at a different place in their journey around cultural intelligence, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So leaders cast a shadow, what they say, what they do, what they prioritize, what they measure. And if as a leader, you're not showing up, that's basically indicating to your organization, yeah, this isn't a priority for me. People are going to interpret that, well, it's not a priority for me either. So culturally diverse teams and inclusive teams create the more unlikely ideas. Honestly, the more likely we're to be able to draw inspiration from seemingly unrelated places. And the idea combinations lead to more unlikely and more innovative ideas. So build it into your strategy from the business standpoint, from your talent strategy, and think about the programs, the mechanisms that you have in place to help push this forward.
Those were some really amazing nuggets there, Rachel, that you shared. And I think there were a couple things that we heard that you might be doing yourself at Amazon Games, but wanted to dig into that a little bit. What steps did Amazon take to build take to build inclusivity into their strategy? I know we've heard a little bit about what you're doing with the leaders at Amazon Games, but can you talk a little bit more about what your strategy might look like as a whole?
Well, we have a 3-year strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when I took the role 16 months ago, roughly, that was one of the first things that I did, was actually putting into place, after listening sessions, after hundreds of interviews with people, looking at the data, of really putting in like 3 key priorities: culture, people, and community. So we have this as a roadmap now, an official roadmap. I'm also part of the broader Amazon Entertainment DEI team. So we represent a massive sort of transmedia organization. So we're in books, we're in Audible, Twitch, Prime Video, games, and music. And so we as a creative entity are now looking at, what do we do to support the cultural intelligence, leadership development, and the individual contributor development around DEI and programs like that. So having a strategy, checking in quarterly. I do quarterly reviews with my leaders, making sure that the data is there for us.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing more about what you're doing at Amazon Games. I'm sure a lot of our viewers right now are busy taking notes. So thank you for sharing all of that. Now we're about to move on to our last question with Tina. So I just want to remind everyone joining us today to send in your questions for our panelists in the chat. We're going to get to them real quickly. So Tina, what barriers do you typically see organizations run into when trying to improve their CQ? How can they overcome these to build a strong culture of inclusivity?
Yeah, the most important thing is understand what matters most, right? So a really key part of me embarking on any culturally intelligent development program or CQ development program with an organization, a company, a studio, team, is being clear on what they're trying to achieve, right? So we know that cultural intelligence brings a host of improved business outcomes, including retention, engagement, innovation, and so on. So we know all these things are going to happen. But what do we want to focus on, and how do we bring clarity to the mission for the teams and the individuals so they know why we're supporting it, right? Is it that we're focusing on attracting more diverse talent because we don't see enough diversity in the room? Are we concerned about equity? In other words, do we not see enough diversity in senior leadership and management levels? So maybe we're bringing diverse talent into the team, but we're not promoting them, and they're just staying low level on the floor. Or perhaps we're losing our diverse talent as quickly as we hire them. Maybe we're just showing that's a symptom of lack of inclusion, right? That there's something going wrong where people of different identities can't come into the team and feel safe, and they're leaving as fast as they're coming in the door, right? So all these, the data points that Rachel pointed out, the fact that we're always looking at the data, understanding, helps highlight where it might be most important for our business. If we don't focus on specific outcomes, that in itself is a blocker, because we can't talk about progress. We can't continue to draw the parallels of, why are we doing this? Why should I care? And it's not easy to work with somebody different than ourselves. It's not easy to ask a team to engage with an external partner halfway across the world. But we know that the business requires that we do that. So how do we support them? And what do they need to be effective? We've got to go back to, what do we do? Right? And then we go back to the social responsibility. Rachel touched on this as well. As a consumer, I expect more of the brands that I support. If I see a game company has a bad history of toxicity, I can't say that word, problems with the way players engage with the game, or that that there's problems with the employees at the organization, I don't want to play those games. I don't want to support that organization, and I'm definitely not going to go work with that company. right? Another really big barrier, and Rachel also touched on that, is this personal commitment to inclusion, because leaders can't just play lip service to this. If they really want to affect change, they have to actually demonstrate through behaviors a commitment to inclusion. They have to be authentic and go past just, oh, here's all our corporate values, but actually model the behaviors they expect in others. And then another final point I want to touch on is that inclusion is a journey, right? Cultural inclusion is something that we have to constantly work on, and I work on every day. I'm trying to improve myself and learn more about being more respectful and effective in different situations. It's not a destination. It's not a single training event or a tick box or a tool that you measure and move on with, right? It's a great start to provide professional development, but tie it to sustainable sustainable approaches, your strategy, the way that we're going to make it stay real consistently. Maybe it's the project charter when you start and you've got a culturally intelligent framework for kicking off a project. You make it real, you make it sustainable and practical every day.
Those were, again, some really great nuggets that you shared. And I really liked how you talked about how inclusion is a journey, it's not a destination. And I think that will help a lot of people shift their mindsets about how they think about building inclusion into their strategy, that it's not these milestones that you're going to say, okay, we did A, now we're going to do B, and yay, we're inclusive, right? It's a constant learning journey. So that's great that you've talked about that. Wanted to dig in a little bit more.
Can I just add to that really quickly?
Absolutely.
I think that the thing that building on it's a journey, we need to meet people where they're at. So everybody's at a different place in this journey. But what I wanted to highlight was there's a difference between intention and impact. So that's what I always want to call out of. We might have good intentions, but if our impact is not happening or it's going sideways, then we failed, especially in this space. So I just really want to call out that there's a big difference between intention and impact in this space.
And that, again, goes back to the learning journey, right? That's really great that you've brought that up, Rachel, because we can act with the best of intentions, but if it's not working for our employees, if we're not seeing the results that we're hoping to, then I think there's been a couple of themes that we've had in our discussion, one of them being around the data, right? If the data is telling us, okay, maybe we need to rethink this a little bit, we shouldn't be scared to do so. And it's okay to admit that we've had a mistake because that's part of the learning journey as well. So those are some really great things that you've shared there. And I'm sure the audience is really happy that you've shared that with them. So that was a lot of great information around cultural intelligence, inclusivity, and its importance. I've learned a lot. I hope the audience has. Now let's see what questions our audience have for you. Again, if you have any questions for Tina and Rachel, please put them into the chat box. We're going to get to your questions now. And as we're waiting for questions to come in, I wanted to make it a little bit personal for myself as I get ready to ask you a question on my own and I go rogue for a minute. So for myself in the gaming industry, what I'm really interested in is kind of around the diverse storytelling part. And I think we've touched on this a little bit, Rachel, when I came to you and asked, what is it about the gaming industry that attracted you to it? And we've started to see more diverse storytelling in other forms of entertainment, like film, TV mediums. Of course, we all remember when Crazy Rich Asians was a really big and important milestone for people in the Asian American community, because that was a movie with the full Asian cast, and that hadn't been done in a really long time, of course. And we're starting to see more of that diverse storytelling. So Tina and Rachel, I'm going to open this up to both of you. Do you see a shift in the gaming industry as well in terms of these diverse stories that we're seeing in games? And what kind of trends are we starting to see?
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is companies like Electronic Arts have entire divisions set up to deal with this topic, right? They're trying to help develop teams in their ability to be more effective in understanding the cultural nuances of their games. How do we represent an identity in a game if that identity doesn't exist on our team? Well, there are ways that we can do that, right? That we can go out and get feedback and assess from a different perspective whether or not we're being respectful in the way we portray that particular identity. I think that there's a lot of different tools out there today to help with culturalization of games to make them more effective for a different audience and to be more respectful for the different diverse people playing those games.
Similar, I pretty much build on what Tina said. Companies are committing resources. And so that's one thing right there. When an organization says, we need to pay attention to this, we're going to put money, people, time behind it to dig into it, to do our due diligence, and then to figure out how does this impact the products that we're making. So organizations like EA, like Amazon Games, we have divisions within our organization that are dedicated to making sure that the opportunity, like as we're thinking of new experiences, we have as many of those variables, nuances, perspectives available to us as we start to go through and design out a new product or experience.
That's honestly really great to hear, because I'm sure before, companies may not have realized that this was a necessity or a team that they needed to have dedicated to this kind of storytelling, and going back to some of the themes that we've talked about to meet their customers where they are now. And those teams are able to kind of say, okay, you're our customer. Let's bring you into this community that we've created. So that's really awesome. So during our conversation, we've talked a little bit about having to attract talent and the diverse talent that now companies obviously have a lot of access to. One being we're in a hybrid environment now. Can we talk about maybe how cultural intelligence might impact some of how we actually hire or promote? Because we have a great comment here from someone that said, the leadership demographics are going to look the same in 10, 20, 30 years if we don't change how we hire or promote. So how can cultural intelligence help that process and make sure that we are committed to hiring those diverse people to represent, whether that be the customers or the business strategy, et cetera?
Yeah. I can touch on this first and then hand off to Rachel. I think if we look at first, how are we attracting from the right places, right? So for example, if we're trying to bring more gender diversity into the boardroom, into the senior leadership, that might be developing the talent on the team, or we just not have enough women on the team, period, to pull from. So we need to attract more. So again, are we focusing more on attracting more talent? So looking at where we're recruiting from and making sure we're recruiting from more diverse locations where women would actively see those postings and be aware of those opportunities? Or is it about developing the women who we already have in the team, giving them more opportunities, stopping mentoring our women and maybe start sponsoring them for opportunities and recognizing that they're already ready to take a step up instead of always saying, we need to grow you first? Rachel, I don't know, I'll hand off to you. What do you think? How can we promote and hire and deal with this changing leadership demographics and address it?
Well, I think by leveling up the competency for our leaders, to be honest, the more they know, the more they'll be able to navigate and understand the barriers that are placed in front of certain identities. Understand not that it's not just about recruiting diverse talent, it's about retaining and developing that talent. So it's a challenge. Like Tina hit on it earlier. It can be difficult to work with somebody who's not the same as you, but that's also a gift. So as people leaders and as org leaders, looking at building your competency and understanding about the lay of the land of your talent and thinking about where are the gaps. And I'm not saying gaps, like I don't like the term, we're hiring for culture fit, because honestly, people use that as an excuse for like-mindedness. I'm looking for, what are we missing on the team in terms of competencies, diversity, perspectives, and how can we bring something in, or a person in, or a perspective in, that's going to help us move forward and into maybe a new innovative idea. So for me, it's really focusing on the leaders to help them understand the impact of diverse thinking and diverse teams.
Those are some really great things to think about in terms of the actual hiring practices, and not just hiring, but retaining, because you're right. If the people don't stay there, then they're still not diverse groups, right? So those are really great things to think about. We actually have a question here from Mario Mendez. And it's a great one. What are the expectations of inclusivity in different cultures? It's very important to the gaming world, like the Japanese one, for example. Is progress being made there?
Yeah. This is a really interesting question to me, because inclusion means so many different things to different cultures, right? And being respectful of a culture, for example, the Japanese culture, but still being inclusive of the fact that not every Japanese person has the same cultural mindset or thinks or behaves the same way, is part of the cultural intelligence mindset and framework of checking our assumptions and being careful about what inclusion means. I think if I come from a place of respectful curiosity, then I can start to understand what an individual needs are, or what an organizational needs are in terms of what inclusion means there. And I can help fit within it or foster it. But I think it's important to respect that, yeah, cultural inclusion and culture means so many different things in so many different locations. And we touched on this when we were chatting about this panel ahead of time, and when I touched on my different experiences with the Women in Game, sorry, the International Women's Day. When we celebrate International Women's Day, that celebration and the mindset behind it looks very different in a culture like Romania versus Sweden versus North America. We're all celebrating that day, but we're celebrating it with a different cultural mindset. So inclusion is really, and to answer the real question, is progress being made there, Mario? I think yes, because we're seeing a more global mindset, or more diversity in games, and we're seeing more of a focus on being inclusive within that global context. So I feel like, yeah, there's progress. We've got a long ways to go still, but we're definitely moving in the right direction, it feels like.
That's a really great point. And I love what you're bringing up around those nuances in those mindset. Not only are there nuances between the countries of where people are located, but even within those countries themselves, right? The different regions that you might be coming from, there's also nuances there. So it's definitely a lot more complicated than what we thought about, but it's very interesting that you bring it up. So thank you. Another question here that we have from Kathleen Hovdestad. I am so sorry if I butchered your last name. How would you deal with an organization who is saying they want to work on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they claim they just aren't getting the applicants to diversify their teams?
I will respond to that. Diversity is not just about recruiting. That is one piece of the mighty puzzle around DEI. So I also believe that can be used as an excuse. Talent is out there. You just need to look for it. You need to maybe look for it in different spaces and different places. So maybe you have one specific pipeline of set of universities or colleges that you tend to go to. Think differently. There's lots of great programs out there that may not be, the top 10 feeder schools. Why are we all just going for those 10 schools? Why aren't we diversifying our approach to sourcing talent? But DEI is not just about recruiting. That's one part of the funnel. There's the people part, which is the recruiting, the sourcing of talent, the recruiting of our talent. Then there's the onboarding experience. What are you doing to onboard these diverse folks? Then there's the development. How are we addressing development? Because statistically, we know that diverse talent doesn't get as many opportunities around development. So making sure we're removing those barriers. Then there's the retention piece. Like, what are we doing to create a culture where they feel like they belong and they can do their best work? How long are they staying in role? So again, traditionally, we see that diverse candidates or diverse talent tend to stay in role longer before they get promoted. So what barriers are at play there? These are all things that can be happening now. So there's the diversity piece, and Tina mentioned this earlier, but then there's the inclusion piece. It's all great if you bring in 200 diverse candidates, but if they leave 6 months later, you failed. So there's the external piece around people, and then there's the internal piece.
I also want to weigh in here too. One other tip I would offer this, Kathleen, you, is consider auditing the way that they're bringing in the applicants. So for example, Rachel mentioned, the source of where the applicants are coming from. They're just not getting the applicants. So that's one way. But another way would be to look at the job postings themselves. So are we excluding, inadvertently excluding different identities, whether it's gender-based or nationality or other, based on the way the job's being described? Do we have language in those job descriptions which is unintentionally discouraging diverse talent from actually actively applying? And that can be quite a significant win for you, just to encourage them to tackle that one issue.
Yeah.
Those are great tips on one, how you can actually source talents from all sorts of different places, and thinking about how, and actually just going through an audit of how you're sourcing your talent, retaining your talent. It's definitely a lot complicated than we give it credit for. But those were some great tips that you've shared, Tina and Rachel, that people can actually bring back to their teams and say, hey, let's review this and see if we're maybe not using inclusive language, or if our onboarding is inadvertently making people feel unsafe or something like that. We have a question here from Ben Hum. How have you weaved CQ into your diversity recruitment practices so that they're not just boxes to be checked or target numbers to be met? And Rachel, I feel like this question could be really good for you. And I know we've kind of talked about it earlier, but maybe you want to go a little bit deeper.
Sure. I mean, I work closely with my talent acquisition team. They're an entity unto themselves. But one of the things that's been happening over the last couple of years is the leveling up of our recruitment, our hiring managers and our recruiters. So making sure that they have cultural intelligence and awareness and the diversity and inclusion lens in all that they do. So that's a big push of making sure that we are leveling up the capabilities of the recruiters and hiring managers in this space, so that it doesn't become a, hey, we need a diverse person on the interview panel. Who can we find? So really think, like, I'm a big process person. People